a very tiny intro to Mongolia, a bit more about why relations with the U.S. matter, and a bit more about the nature of those relations. Obviously, Mongolia is a big country. The comparator is Alaska, same size with a small population, 2.5 million people. One comparison I often say is that my first trip, the first time around back in 2001, was to South Gobi province, one of 21 provinces in Mongolia. It's about the same size of the country of Bangladesh, which has 150 million people. That whole province in Mongolia had 40,000 people. So that's sort of a comparison, if you will, in terms of a very large country, but lightly populated. Obviously situated between Russia and China. In that sense, I think has one foot in Northeast Asia and also one foot in Central Asia. Although some Mongolians will sometimes note that only a single country, Russia, separates them from Europe. So I think that's sort of an indication of their outward kind of feeling. And indeed, their foreign policy, they talk about third neighbors. They realize they have to have good relations, and they do have good relations with their immediate neighbors, Russia and China. But they also have what they call a third neighbor policy, which is really all about cultivating relationships with the rest of the world. That includes the U.S., it includes other countries as well. But I think the U.S. relationship matters to them for reasons I'll get into later. It was interesting, somebody gave a little bit of an introduction to Mongolia. I have 4 things that I think are attractive for maybe foreigners coming there. One is the spacious landscape, one is the living nomadic culture, one is the interesting history, and the 4th one, just to echo what was already said, was the very great music. And again, it's a unique feature, and it's beginning to be understood more around the world as well, the throat singing and other aspects of the music. Other ways you may have heard about Mongolia, I don't know if anybody's been to Cirque du Soleil. I know they've been in Atlanta for some period of time. The contortionists often come from Mongolia. I don't know if you've seen that part of Cirque du Soleil, but they have, in fact, is a friend of ours who is the trainer and in some sense the identifier of talent in that area, which often comes from Mongolia. There's also sumo wrestling. I don't know if you've been to Japan, but I think somewhat to the consternation occasionally of the Japanese, some of the best sumo wrestlers in Mongolia are in fact in recent years in Japan have in recent years come from Mongolia, which is part of a living tradition because what they call the 3 manly arts. It's a very sporting nation. The 3 manly arts are basically horseback riding, wrestling, and archery. So they have that long-standing history of an interest in wrestling. A book that came out several years ago that in some sense brought Mongolia onto the map was something was written by Jack Weatherford, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. And it's an interesting book because it does talk about how that link between Asia and Europe came about through Genghis Khan and the empire that came with it. Generally speaking, though, although they've had years of isolation, it's a forward-looking country with people very interested in the broader world. A bit about relations with the U.S. Actually, I'm going to link them to. Typically, I mean, ambassadors are always there at the pleasure of the president, so you can't say with certainty, but a typical ambassadorship might be for 3 years. And it's interesting to me, again, I've been there for 3 months, but each of the next 3 years has an anniversary of some note. This year is 20 years of democracy in Mongolia, which is kind of interesting because they did make that decision 20 years ago to go on a different path. At some level, it sets them apart from their neighbors. But for all the challenges and sometimes even steps backwards, the fact of the matter is that Mongolia has done strikingly well in this area and has a system of elected government, has presidents and parliamentarians that come and go, have, I think with the mark of a democracy is a transition, that they have different political parties. In fact, right now they have a president from one party and a dominant, it's a coalition government, but they also have most of the members in parliament come from a different party. So I can answer questions about it if you want, but it's an interesting dynamic, and I think it's a matter of self-identification with Europe, with the United States, with Canada and Australia, the fact that they have pursued this interest in democracy. Interestingly enough, the current president, Albert Dorch, was in fact a student leader 20 years ago, and so it's interesting to see how that's unfolded over the years. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of independence from China. As again, people know the history, and it's a long history, but basically 1911 marked the reassertion, because of course they had been independent in years past, but marked the reassertion of an independent Mongolia, and that's one that they'll be very interested in. Again, the fact is that China is important to Mongolia. I think it buys 2/3 of their exports, 1/3 of their imports come from China. Most of the foreign investment comes from China as well. But they really do at the same time want what I guess I call three-dimensional relationships with the rest of the world, which again is why that relationship, not only with the U.S. but also with Europe, with Korea, with Japan, with Australia, and with Canada, is also important. And I think that they think of their third neighbor approach as a way to affirm their own independence. The year after that actually is another significant year because it marks 25 years of a U.S.-Mongolia relationship. This happened in 1987. There were other contacts. If you go back to the early 1900s, it's quite fascinating that there were American businessmen in Ulaanbaatar basically dealing in furs and the tea trade and that kind of trading stuff going on. But it was a link through Beijing on into Ulaanbaatar, onto Kyatka, and even on into Russia. And beyond that, you had missionaries back then in the early 1900s, kind of fascinating. Someone recently wrote an article about the American missionaries in Mongolia in the early 1900s. That too is part of the history. You fast forward to the 1920s, and then you have Roy Chapman Andrews, who some people regard as the precursor to Indiana Jones. But those were the years of looking for dinosaurs in the Gobi. So that was useful. Fast forward to the 1940s, actually the first leading American politician to go to Mongolia was Vice President Wallace, who on a visit to Russia during the Second World War stopped back in Mongolia. Intriguingly enough, had an interest in Eastern religions and visited the Gandan Monastery at a time, of course, when Buddhism and all religions were being quite severely repressed. There were even times, perhaps in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we might have had relations. Of course, there were other issues. I think oftentimes when the Mongolians wanted to have relations with us, for some reason we weren't able to go forward. And conversely, sometimes when we reached out, they were concerned about the Soviets. So the fact of the matter is, it wasn't until 1987 that those relationships came about. But again, it'll be hopefully my privilege to be in Mongolia during that 25-year celebration.